Hi everyone. This week we're talking about the taking of a human life. And you'll notice that the chapter covers many different areas. Everything from suicide to euthanasia, which we'll be getting into more detail a little bit later in the course, to war and capital punishment and terrorism, defense of the innocent, basically anything having to do with the taking of a human life. I just wanted to point out a few things about this week's discussion. If you'll remember back to our first chapter, the value of life principle is the principle that usually comes before all others. So what I'm saying here is that we put the value of life principle at the top when we're trying to make a determination about what's morally right or wrong and how we should make a choice. So that comes into conflict then with some of our other principles. The principle of freedom and the principle of justice and individuality. So basically, when we're trying to make a decision, we're weighing all these different principles against each other to try to determine which one should come out on top. Now, in things like euthanasia, a lot of times, if it's an end-of-life situation and a person is terminally ill, we might put the principle of individuality or freedom of choice, death with dignity, over the principle of taking a human life. Another situation that this comes up is in abortion. And we're going to be talking about that later in the class. But because we're often weighing all these principles against each other, it's important to understand that in the rest of the chapters we'll cover in the course, these principles are always being weighed against one another. And depending on your belief system is the way that you will choose which principle comes out on top. Something we'll talk about later, as I said, is abortion. And for example, if you believe in the value of life principle and that supersedes for you the freedom of choice principle, then you may find yourself on the pro-life side of the fence instead of the pro-choice side of the fence. When it comes to issues of war, terrorism, capital punishment, here we're again examining these principles conflicting with one another. A lot of times we're looking at, in terms of war in particular, we're looking at justice. We're looking at a set of beliefs that is one culture against another culture. Western culture, for example, against Eastern culture or Arab culture, Middle East culture. And so we're trying to determine which values take precedence and what we're trying to protect. And so oftentimes justice comes in here. And if we believe that unjust things are going on, for example, in another country, then we might make an attempt to try to fight those human rights issues by going to war and by valuing our own principles over that of another culture. And that takes us back to some of the earlier conversations we had about the importance of cultural relativism. Now, depending on your belief system, some of you will think that it is important to uphold our cultural values and they're worth fighting for and something that we should put above other cultures' values. While others of you might think that it's important to consider cultural values and we should not put our own values above another culture's values. Now we can see this happening time and time again in the recent past and also in the distant past, and that is, the attempt to put our values against another culture's values and determine whose values should come out on top. So the chapter, I think, does a really nice job outlining all of the arguments for and against war, terrorism, suicide, death of the innocent, and capital punishment. So I don't really need to go over those arguments. I think it's pretty easy to just take a look at the headers and then read the paragraphs underneath about the various arguments. But what I do want to go over is that in all of the arguments that we'll cover in different areas of ethics, including some of the later chapters we'll get to on lying and abortion and sexual freedom and so forth, there is always the domino argument. The domino argument, also known as the slippery slope argument, is that once you do something, X, then you're at risk for doing more of that thing. In this chapter, since it's taking a human life, the domino argument has to do with if you allow someone to take a human life or a human life to be taken, then you're opening yourself up to justify other situations of taking a human life. And this goes down a slippery slope and means that you will ultimately be able to justify a lot more situations of taking of human life. Usually we see taking of a human life in areas of self-defense as acceptable. However, taking of a human life in other circumstances, murder and homicide and things of that nature, are not seen as acceptable. However, the slippery slope argument would say that once you take a human life, perhaps in the area of self-defense, that might lead you into considering life as being less valuable. Now, human beings are complex, and I'm certainly not suggesting that this would happen for everybody. I just wanted you to be aware of this view, and it's one that we'll be covering in later chapters as well. So another thing that I wanted to point out is that at the end of these chapters, there's an evaluation of the subjects regarding each of the theories. So if you flip past the summary to the very end of the chapter, you will see each theory is explored and its relationship to the topic we're covering. So this week is taking of a human life. You'll see how ethical egoists evaluate taking of a human life, how utilitarians evaluate it, how virtue ethicists evaluate it, and so on. So I wanted to point that out because that's going to be an important key factor for you as far as your application portion of the assignment and also when we do the case studies. Okay, that's all I've got for this chapter, and I will see you in the discussion area.